23-year-old Georgina Roberts never imagined that the happiest day of her life would turn into a courtroom battle that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her identity. What started as a simple adoption ceremony in downtown Phoenix became a DNA nightmare that exposed decades of lies, forgery, and a truth so shocking it would redefine her entire existence.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Georgina Roberts adjusted her navy blazer for the third time as she sat in the cramped waiting room of the Maricopa County Family Court. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the nervous energy that had been building for weeks. At 23, she was older than most people going through adoption proceedings, but her story wasn't typical. The Johnson family had been her foster parents since she was 16, taking her in during one of the darkest periods of her life. Now, 7 years later, she was finally making it official. Robert and Susan Johnson sat beside her, their faces glowing with the same excitement that had been building in their modest Tempe home for months. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this," Susan whispered, reaching over to squeeze Georgina's hand. Her graying hair was perfectly styled for the occasion, and she wore the same pearl earrings she'd worn to Georgina's high school graduation. "After everything you've been through, sweetheart, you deserve a real family." Robert nodded, his weathered construction worker hands folded neatly in his lap. "Should have done this years ago, kiddo, but better late than never, right?" Georgina smiled, though something flickered behind her eyes. The truth was, she'd always felt like she belonged with the Johnsons, from the moment she'd walked through their front door. Their modest ranch house on Maple Street had been more of a home than anywhere she'd lived in her chaotic childhood. But there was still a part of her that wondered about the missing pieces of her story. Her early years were a blur of temporary placements and social worker visits. Her birth mother, Rebecca Martinez, had struggled with addiction and had died when Georgina was 12. The identity of her father had always been listed as unknown on every document she'd ever seen. For years, she'd created elaborate fantasies about who he might be, sometimes a successful businessman who didn't know she existed, other times a young man who'd simply been too scared to take responsibility. The courthouse hallway buzzed with activity as other families moved through their own legal proceedings. Georgina watched a young couple emerge from a courtroom, beaming as they held their freshly signed adoption papers. Soon, that would be her. Soon, she'd have the last name Johnson, and all the legal protections that came with being someone's official daughter. "Miss Roberts," a court clerk appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "We're ready for you in courtroom 3B. The walk down the hallway felt surreal. Georgina had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering documents, attending counseling sessions, and filling out endless paperwork. She'd even splurged on a new outfit. The navy blazer and matching skirt made her feel professional and adult, ready to officially close the chapter on her tumultuous past. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over the courtroom with a warm but authoritative presence. She was known in the Phoenix family court system for her fairness and her genuine care for the families that appeared before her. At 58, she'd overseen thousands of adoptions, each one reinforcing her belief in the power of chosen families. "Good morning," Judge Hendricks said as they took their seats. "This is certainly one of my favorite types of proceedings. Adult adoptions show us that family isn't just about biology, it's about love, commitment, and choice." The preliminary questions were routine. Judge Hendricks verified their identities, confirmed that all parties were entering the adoption voluntarily, and reviewed the background checks that had been completed months earlier. Everything was proceeding exactly as Georgina had imagined it would. But as they moved through the legal formalities, Georgina found her mind wandering to the gaps in her personal history. She'd spent years in the foster care system, moving between homes that ranged from genuinely caring to merely adequate. Some families had treated her well, others had made it clear she was just a source of monthly income from the state. The Johnsons had been different from the beginning. Robert worked long hours at a construction company, coming home covered in dust, but always with energy for homework help or a game of cards. Susan worked part-time at a local grocery store, but she approached mothering like it was her true calling. They'd never made Georgina feel like a burden or a temporary arrangement. The state of Arizona recognizes that family connections can be formed through love and commitment, not just through biological relationships. Georgina, you've been with the Johnson family for 7 years, and they've provided you with stability, support, and unconditional love during some of your most formative years.
Georgina nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She thought about her graduation day, when Robert and Susan had cheered louder than anyone in the auditorium. She remembered Susan staying up all night with her when she'd had food poisoning during her sophomore year of college. She thought about Robert teaching her to drive in the empty parking lot behind the grocery store, his patience infinite as she stalled the old Honda Civic over and over again. These were her real parents, the ones who'd earned the title through daily acts of love and sacrifice. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's fingers on her stenotype machine. Judge Hendricks was reviewing the final documents when her expression shifted slightly. She paused, reading something more carefully. "I notice here that there's an unusual notation in your file, Georgina," the judge said, her tone still warm but now carrying a hint of confusion. "It appears there was some recent activity regarding your birth records. Just last month, there was a request for information filed by—" She paused, reading from her computer screen, "a Mrs. Patricia Daniels of Scottsdale." Georgina's stomach dropped. She'd never heard that name before in her life. Susan and Robert exchanged glances. "Is that something we need to be concerned about, Your Honor?" Robert asked. "It's probably nothing," Judge Hendricks said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Sometimes distant relatives surface when adoption proceedings become public record. It could be a cousin or family friend who just heard about today's ceremony. But even as she spoke, there was a commotion outside the courtroom. Voices were rising in the hallway, and the court clerk was speaking in urgent, hushed tones to someone just beyond the doorway. Georgina felt a chill run down her spine. After years of stability with the Johnsons, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have her life upended by unexpected developments. The foster care system had taught her that safety was temporary, that just when you got comfortable, everything could change in an instant. The courtroom door opened, and the clerk stepped inside, looking flustered. "Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a woman outside who claims to have important information about this adoption case. She says she has documentation that could affect the proceedings." Judge Hendricks frowned. "What kind of documentation?" "She claims to have proof that the minor's parentage has been misrepresented in the official records, Your Honor. She's requesting an immediate stay of proceedings." The words hit Georgina like a physical blow. Misrepresented parentage? She'd never known her father's identity, so how could anything be misrepresented? And who was this woman who'd appeared out of nowhere on what was supposed to be the most important day of her adult life? Susan's hand found hers and squeezed tight. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "Whatever this is, we'll handle it together." But Georgina's mind was racing. She thought about all the years she'd wondered about her father, all the nights she'd fallen asleep creating stories about who he might be. She'd always assumed he was just some guy who'd walked away from responsibility, leaving her mother to raise a child alone. The possibility that there was more to the story, that there were documents and evidence she'd never seen, was both terrifying and intoxicating. Judge Hendricks looked troubled. In her decades on the bench, she'd learned to trust her instincts, and something about the situation felt significant. "I think we need to hear what this woman has to say. Bring her in." As they waited for the mysterious Patricia Daniels to enter the courtroom, Georgina's entire world began to tilt on its axis. The adoption ceremony that was supposed to give her closure and security was instead opening doors to questions she'd never thought to ask. She had no idea that the woman about to walk through that courtroom door would challenge everything she thought she knew about her identity, her past, and the very foundations of her existence. The comfortable life she'd built with the Johnsons was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The current reality that had felt so solid just moments before was already beginning to crumble. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Patricia Daniels swept into the courtroom like a woman on a mission. At 45, she had the polished appearance of someone accustomed to getting her way. Designer handbag, perfectly styled blonde hair, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached the judge's bench, clutching a manila folder thick with documents. "Your Honor, thank you for allowing me to speak," she began, her voice carrying a slight Southern accent that seemed oddly out of place in the Phoenix courtroom. "I'm Patricia Daniels, and I have information that will fundamentally change everything about this adoption proceeding." Georgina studied the woman's face, searching for any hint of familiarity. There was something about her sharp cheekbones and the way she held her mouth that seemed vaguely recognizable, but Georgina couldn't place where she might have seen her before. Judge Hendricks gestured toward the witness stand. "Please state your relationship to the parties involved and explain why you believe you have standing to interrupt these proceedings." Patricia's eyes locked onto Georgina's with an intensity that made her squirm in her seat. "Your Honor, I am the legal wife of Marcus Daniels, who is the biological father of this young woman. We've been married for 18 years, and I have documentation proving that my husband's parental rights were never properly terminated." The courtroom fell silent. Georgina felt the blood drain from her face as the words sunk in. A father. A real, living father with a name and an address and a wife who was standing 10 feet away from her. "That's impossible," Susan Johnson whispered, her voice barely audible. Georgina's father was listed as unknown on all her documentation. Patricia smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. "That's exactly the problem, Mrs. Johnson. The records were deliberately falsified to hide my husband's identity. Rebecca Martinez, Georgina's birth mother, was having an affair with Marcus while he was going through a difficult period in our marriage. When she became pregnant, she agreed to keep his identity secret in exchange for financial support." Judge Hendricks leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mrs. Daniels, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" "I have everything, Your Honor." Patricia opened her folder and began spreading documents across the prosecution table. Hospital records from Georgina's birth showing Marcus signed papers acknowledging paternity. Bank records showing monthly payments made to Rebecca Martinez for over 12 years. And most importantly, I have Marcus's sworn affidavit stating his intention to claim his parental rights now that Rebecca is deceased. Georgina's hands began to shake. Everything she thought she knew about her origins was being rewritten in real time. Her mother had never mentioned receiving money from anyone, but then again, Rebecca had been secretive about many things during her struggles with addiction. Robert Johnson stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Now hold on just a minute. If this Marcus fellow is really her father, where has he been for the past 23 years? Where was he when she was bouncing between foster homes? Where was he when she needed a family?" Patricia's expression hardened. "My husband was protecting our family and our other children." Rebecca assured him that Georgina was being well cared for. "We had no idea she'd entered the foster system until recently when we learned about today's adoption proceedings through public records." "Other children?" The words slipped from Georgina's lips before she could stop them. "You have 2 half-brothers," Patricia said, her tone softening slightly for the first time. "Tyler is 20 and attending Arizona State University. Cameron is 17 and just started his senior year of high school. They don't know about you yet. We wanted to handle this situation delicately." The revelation hit Georgina like a tidal wave. Not only did she have a father, but she had siblings, brothers who'd grown up in what was presumably a stable, intact family, while she navigated the chaos of the foster system alone. Judge Hendricks was examining the documents Patricia had submitted, her frown deepening with each page. "Mrs. Daniels, some of these documents appear to have discrepancies in the dates and signatures. The hospital records, in particular, show signs of alteration." "Your Honor, I can assure you that all documentation is authentic. My husband was young and scared when Georgina was born, but he did the right thing by acknowledging paternity and providing support. The apparent discrepancies may be due to the age of the documents or copying issues. But even as Patricia spoke, Georgina noticed something odd about the woman's demeanor. There was a tension around her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled through the papers. For someone who claimed to have ironclad evidence, she seemed remarkably nervous.
The court clerk approached Judge Hendricks and whispered something in her ear. The judge nodded grimly and turned back to address the courtroom. I'm going to order a temporary stay of these adoption proceedings pending a thorough investigation of these claims. Mrs. Daniels, I'm also going to require independent verification of these documents through our forensics department. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. Your Honor, surely that's not necessary. My husband is prepared to come forward immediately and claim his daughter. We've already consulted with attorneys about the proper procedures for asserting parental rights. Where is your husband today? Judge Hendricks asked pointedly. He's dealing with a work emergency in Denver, but he's fully committed to being part of Georgina's life moving forward. In fact, we're prepared to offer her a place in our family immediately. Georgina felt sick. The woman was talking about her like she was a piece of property to be transferred from one family to another. She looked over at Susan and Robert, seeing her own confusion and hurt reflected in their faces. I don't understand, Georgina said, her voice growing stronger. If your husband is my father, why are you the one here? Why isn't he fighting for me himself? Patricia's smile faltered. As I mentioned, he's traveling for business. But Georgina, you have to understand, you belong with your real family. The Daniels family can provide you with opportunities that... She glanced dismissively at the Johnsons. Well, opportunities that you wouldn't have otherwise. The condescension in her tone sparked something fierce in Georgina's chest. The Johnsons are my real family. They've been my family for 7 years. Blood is thicker than water, dear, and Marcus has rights as your biological father that supersede any emotional attachments you may have formed. Judge Hendricks intervened before the situation could escalate further. Mrs. Daniels, I want to be very clear about something. Even if your husband is proven to be Georgina's biological father, she is an adult. No one can force her to have a relationship with anyone she doesn't want to be involved with. Parental rights are primarily relevant for custody and support issues involving minor children. Patricia's mask slipped completely for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Of course, Your Honor, we simply want the opportunity to welcome our daughter into the family where she belongs. But there was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't really about family reunification at all. Georgina caught the look that passed between Susan and Robert. They'd heard it too. As the hearing concluded and dates were set for document verification and potential DNA testing, Georgina felt her carefully constructed world spinning out of control. The adoption that was supposed to give her legal security had instead opened a Pandora's box of questions about her past. Walking out of the courthouse, she was bombarded with emotions she couldn't sort through. Excitement at the possibility of finally knowing her father's identity warred with suspicion about Patricia's true motives. The prospect of having brothers intrigued her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something fundamentally wrong about the way Patricia had presented her case. Don't worry, sweetheart, Susan said as they reached the parking garage. Whatever happens, you're our daughter. A piece of paper doesn't change that. But as they drove home through the familiar streets of Tempe, Georgina couldn't stop thinking about Patricia's documents and the way the woman's hands had trembled when Judge Hendricks questioned their authenticity. Something about this entire situation felt orchestrated, like Patricia was reading from a script she'd rehearsed but hadn't quite memorized. And the biggest question of all remained unanswered. If Marcus Daniels really was her father and really wanted a relationship with her, why had he sent his wife to fight his battles? The inciting incident that would reshape her entire life had arrived with a briefcase full of suspicious documents and a woman whose motives remained frustratingly unclear. The drive home from the courthouse was suffocating in its silence. Georgina stared out the passenger window at the desert landscape blurring past.
her mind racing with fragments of the morning's revelations. Every few minutes, Susan would glance back at her through the rearview mirror with concerned eyes, while Robert's knuckles remained white as he gripped the steering wheel. Back at the Johnson house on Maple Street, the familiar comfort of home felt somehow foreign. The living room, where she'd spent countless evenings watching movies with her adoptive parents, now seemed like a sanctuary under siege. The framed photos on the mantelpiece, her high school graduation, family vacations to Sedona, birthday celebrations, suddenly felt like evidence of a life that might not legally belong to her. "I'm going to make some coffee," Susan announced, clearly needing something to do with her hands. "And then we're going to figure this out together." But Georgina was already pulling out her laptop, her journalism major instincts kicking into overdrive. "I need to research this Marcus Daniels. If he's really my father, there has to be some trace of him online." The internet search yielded surprisingly little information. Marcus Daniels appeared to be a real estate developer based in Scottsdale, with a modest online presence consisting mainly of professional listings and a few mentions in local business publications. His company, Desert Vista Properties, specialized in luxury residential developments in the Phoenix metropolitan area. What struck Georgina as odd was the lack of personal information. No social media profiles, no family photos, no mention of his wife Patricia and the 2 sons she'd referenced in court. For a successful businessman in 2024, his digital footprint was almost suspiciously minimal. "Look at this," she said, turning her laptop screen toward Robert and Susan. "This guy supposedly has 2 teenage and young adult sons, but there's not a single family photo anywhere online. What kind of father doesn't have pictures of his kids on his business website or LinkedIn profile?" Robert leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "Could be one of those privacy-conscious types. Some folks don't like putting their family business out there for the world to see." But Susan shook her head, her maternal instincts clearly troubled. "Something about that woman didn't sit right with me. The way she talked about you like you were a business transaction. And did you notice how she kept checking her watch, like she was following some kind of schedule?" Georgina had noticed, but she'd been too overwhelmed to process all the subtle warning signs. Now, in the safety of the Johnson kitchen, she began to dissect every detail of Patricia's courtroom performance. She knew too much about the legal system, Georgina realized. The way she used specific terminology, how she had all those documents organized, it was like she'd been preparing for this confrontation for months. The more they analyzed the morning's events, the more questions arose. Why had Patricia waited until the exact day of the adoption ceremony to come forward? How had she obtained such detailed information about Georgina's foster care history? And most importantly, why was she so insistent on DNA testing if she was confident about the documentation she'd presented? Georgina's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend and college roommate, Maya. "How did the adoption ceremony go? Are you officially a Johnson now?" The simple question hit Georgina like a punch to the gut. How could she explain that what was supposed to be the happiest day of her adult life had turned into a legal nightmare involving mysterious relatives and forged documents? Instead of responding, she closed her phone and returned to her research. Something Patricia had said in court kept nagging at her. The claim that Marcus had been making monthly payments to her birth mother for over 12 years. If that was true, there should be some record of it somewhere. "I need to go through my mom's things," Georgina announced suddenly. "When she died, the state gave me a box of her personal belongings. I never looked through most of it because it was too painful, but maybe there's something there." The box had been stored in the Johnson garage for over a decade, gathering dust between Christmas decorations and old sporting equipment. As Georgina carried it into the house, she felt the weight of her mother's abbreviated life, an entire human existence reduced to a cardboard container that could be lifted with one hand. Inside, she found the expected remnants of a troubled life. Expired identification cards, a few pieces of costume jewelry, letters from various social service agencies. But at the bottom, wrapped in a faded silk scarf, was a small leather address book that Georgina had never seen before. The pages were filled with Rebecca's careful handwriting,
phone numbers, addresses, and cryptic notations that suggested a more organized side of her mother than Georgina remembered. Most of the entries were innocuous: doctor's appointments, friends' contact information, reminders about bill due dates. But on the very last page, written in different ink and clearly added much later, was a single entry that made Georgina's blood run cold. MD, Phoenix First National, account number 47829, emergency only. G's future. Phoenix First National, she whispered, showing the entry to Susan and Robert. That's a bank. And look, G's future. She was talking about me. Robert's construction-weathered face darkened. If your mother had a secret bank account with money from this Marcus character, why didn't she use it when she was struggling? Why let you end up in foster care if there were funds available? The question hung in the air like an accusation against the dead. Georgina had spent years trying to understand her mother's choices, the addiction that had consumed her, the series of decisions that had ultimately separated them. The possibility that there had been financial resources available all along was almost too devastating to consider. Maybe she couldn't access it, Susan suggested gently. Maybe there were conditions attached to the money. Georgina was already dialing Phoenix First National's customer service line, but the automated system quickly informed her that account information could only be released to authorized users with proper identification and security credentials. Frustration bubbled over into anger. This is insane! Some stranger shows up claiming to be my stepmother, waves around a bunch of suspicious documents, and suddenly my entire life is on hold? Meanwhile, I can't even find out if my own mother had a bank account because of privacy laws. The afternoon stretched on with more dead ends and mounting anxiety. Every online search for information about Marcus Daniels or his family yielded the same minimal results. Every attempt to verify Patricia's claims hit bureaucratic roadblocks or required legal processes that could take weeks to complete. But at the dinner, that the real emotional weight of the situation finally crashed over Georgina. Susan had made her favorite meal, homemade lasagna with garlic bread, the same comfort food she'd prepared for every milestone and crisis over the past 7 years. What if they're right? Georgina asked suddenly, setting down her fork. What if Marcus Daniels really is my biological father? What if I do have brothers who've been living 20 minutes away this whole time? Then we'll deal with that when we know for sure, Robert said firmly. But sweetheart, biology doesn't erase the past 7 years. It doesn't change the fact that we love you and you love us. But what if they have more legal claim to me than you do? What if they can somehow stop the adoption? Susan reached across the table and took her hand. Georgina, honey, you're 23 years old. Nobody can make you do anything you don't want to do. Even if this Marcus person is your father, even if his wife's documents are legitimate, you get to choose your own family. But Georgina wasn't convinced. The foster care system had taught her that adults with official documents and legal standing could disrupt her life at any moment. She'd lived through enough midnight relocations and sudden placement changes to know that stability was always conditional, always subject to the whims of people with more power than she had. That night, lying in her childhood bedroom surrounded by photos and mementos from her years with the Johnsons, she felt the walls of her carefully constructed identity beginning to crumble. The security she'd found in this house, with these people, suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Her phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. This is Tyler Daniels. My mom told me about today. I'd like to meet my sister. Georgina stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the reply button. The brother she'd never known existed was reaching out, offering connection and answers. But accepting his invitation felt like a betrayal of the family that actually raised her. She turned off her phone without responding, but sleep remained elusive. Outside her window, the familiar sounds of the Tempe neighborhood,
Dogs barking, late-night traffic, the distant hum of air conditioners provided a soundtrack to her spiraling thoughts. Tomorrow would bring DNA tests and document verification, official investigations that would determine the legal truth of her parentage. But tonight, Georgina was caught between two versions of her story, unsure which one would ultimately define her future.
The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Johnson household. Georgina was nursing her second cup of coffee and staring at Tyler Daniels' unanswered text when the doorbell rang at 8:30 a.m. Through the front window, she could see a woman in her 60s standing on the porch, holding a manila envelope and wearing the kind of sensible shoes that suggested she meant business. "Are you Georgina Roberts?" the woman asked when Susan opened the door. "My name is Detective Angela Morrison, retired from the Phoenix Police Department. I heard about your situation through some mutual contacts in the legal system, and I think you need to hear what I have to say." Detective Morrison had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades dealing with Phoenix's criminal underworld, but her eyes held a warmth that immediately put Georgina at ease. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who'd learned to trust her instincts above all else. "I spent the last 15 years of my career working financial fraud cases," Morrison explained as they settled in the Johnson living room. "Identity theft, document forgery, inheritance scams, you name it, I've seen it. And yesterday's courtroom drama has all the hallmarks of a sophisticated con job." Georgina leaned forward eagerly. "You think Patricia Daniels is lying?" "I think Patricia Daniels is running a very elaborate long-term scheme, and you're the target." Morrison opened her envelope and spread several photographs across the coffee table. "These were taken outside the courthouse yesterday after your hearing." The photos showed Patricia Daniels in the parking garage, but she wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit was handing her a thick envelope while checking his watch nervously. In the background, a black sedan with tinted windows sat idling with its engine running. "Who's the man?" Robert asked, studying the images. "That's Vincent Torres, a known associate of several white-collar criminal enterprises in the Southwest. He specializes in what law enforcement calls family disruption schemes, elaborate cons that target people during vulnerable life events like adoptions, inheritances, or weddings." Susan's face paled. "You're saying this whole thing is fake? That there is no Marcus Daniels?" Morrison shook her head. "Oh, Marcus Daniels is real enough. He's a moderately successful real estate developer, just like Patricia claimed. But here's the interesting part. He's been in Europe for the past 6 months, overseeing a resort development project in southern Spain. I confirmed his location through customs records and his business partner's social media posts." The revelation hit Georgina like a physical blow. "So he has no idea any of this is happening?" Not only does he have no idea, but according to his business associate, Marcus has never been married to anyone named Patricia. His actual wife is named Jennifer, and they've been married for 22 years. They have twin daughters who are currently juniors at Northwestern University. Georgina felt the room spinning around her. Then who is Patricia, and why is she doing this? Morrison pulled out a thick file folder and opened it to reveal police reports, court documents, and surveillance photos spanning several years. Patricia Daniels, though that's not her real name, is part of a criminal network that specializes in adoption disruption fraud. Her real name is Patricia Vance, and she's been running variations of the scam across multiple states. The detective explained the intricate details of the con. Patricia and her associates would monitor court records for adult adoption proceedings, then research the adoptee's background to identify potential financial motives. In Georgina's case, they'd discovered that her mother had died without leaving a will, which meant any assets she might have possessed would legally belong to her next of kin. "But my mother didn't have any assets," Georgina protested. "She died broke and alone in a county hospital." "That's where you're wrong," Morrison said, pulling out another document. Your mother had a life insurance policy through the state assistance program. It wasn't much, about $50,000, but it's been sitting unclaimed in a state escrow account for over a decade. Patricia discovered this through her network's research into unclaimed property databases. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The mysterious bank account notation in her mother's address book, Patricia's insistence on DNA testing, her urgency in disrupting the adoption proceedings, it all made sense once the financial motive became clear. But how would proving paternity help her steal the insurance money? Georgina asked. Morrison's expression darkened. Because she's not just claiming that Marcus is your father. According to the forged documents she filed with the court yesterday, she's claiming that Marcus legally adopted you when you were an infant, which would make her your legal stepmother. If those documents were accepted as authentic, she could potentially claim authority over your mother's estate as your legal guardian. Robert's face flushed with anger. But Georgina is 23 years old. She doesn't need a guardian.
True, but estate law gets complicated when it comes to unclaimed assets from deceased parents. Patricia's betting that she can create enough legal confusion to either force a settlement or gain access to the funds through fraudulent documentation. The sophistication of the scheme was breathtaking in its audacity. Patricia had spent months researching Georgina's background, timing her courtroom appearance perfectly to maximize psychological impact, and creating a false identity, complete with forged documents and manufactured emotional appeals. "What about Tyler?" Georgina asked, remembering the text message. "The boy who claimed to be my brother." Morrison consulted her notes. "Tyler Vance, Patricia's actual son. He's 19, not 20, and he's currently on probation for credit card fraud in Tucson. He's part of the family business, you might say. His job is to establish emotional connections with the Marks to make the con more believable." The betrayal cut deeper than Georgina had expected. For a brief moment, she'd allowed herself to imagine having siblings, a biological family that might fill some of the empty spaces in her personal history. Learning that even that connection was fabricated felt like losing family members she'd never actually had. "How do we stop them?" Susan asked, her protective instincts in full force. "The good news is that their documentation is so poorly forged that any competent forensic analysis will expose the fraud immediately. The bad news is that they're counting on you being too emotionally compromised to think clearly about their claims." Morrison went on to explain that Patricia's network had used similar tactics successfully in at least 6 other cases across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico. They targeted people during emotional transitions, used fabricated family connections to create confusion, and often succeeded in extracting settlements or gaining access to assets before their victims realized they'd been conned. "The key to their success is time pressure," Morrison said. "They create artificial urgency around legal deadlines, threaten expensive court battles, and make emotional appeals that cloud their victims' judgment. They're counting on you being so overwhelmed that you'll agree to some kind of compromise rather than fighting them." But Morrison also had good news. She'd already contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division, and they were preparing to arrest Patricia and her associates on multiple federal charges, including wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. The evidence Morrison had gathered over the past several months would be more than sufficient to secure convictions. "Your case is actually the breakthrough we've been waiting for," Morrison explained. "Patricia got overconfident and left too many digital footprints this time. Her mistake was using the same forged document template that we've seen in previous cases." As Morrison prepared to leave, she handed Georgina a business card for a family law attorney who specializes in adoption proceedings. "Jennifer Walsh has agreed to take your case pro bono. She'll make sure your adoption goes through without any further interference from these criminals." Standing on the front porch, Morrison placed a reassuring hand on Georgina's shoulder. "I know this has been a traumatic experience, but I want you to understand something important. You were targeted because you're in a transition period, making positive changes in your life.
Criminals like Patricia prey on people during moments of growth and transformation. "Why are you helping me?" Georgina asked. "You're retired. You don't have to get involved in this." Morrison smiled, and for the first time, Georgina saw something vulnerable in the detective's tough exterior. "Because 35 years ago, I was a scared kid aging out of the foster system with no family and no support. Someone helped me when I needed it most, and I've been paying it forward ever since." As Morrison drove away, Georgina felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The mentor who'd appeared to guide her through this crisis hadn't just provided information, she'd restored Georgina's faith in her ability to distinguish between truth and deception, between people who genuinely cared about her well-being and those who saw her as a target. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the realization of how close she'd come to being victimized by people who'd exploited her deepest vulnerabilities. The search for belonging and family connection that had driven her toward the adoption ceremony had also made her susceptible to Patricia's manipulation. But now, armed with Detective Morrison's guidance and evidence, Georgina was ready to fight back. Armed with Detective Morrison's revelations, Georgina felt a surge of determination she hadn't experienced since her college graduation. The vulnerability and confusion that had plagued her since Patricia's courtroom ambush was transforming into focused anger and resolve. For the first time in her adult life, she had clear evidence of someone trying to exploit her, and she was ready to fight back. The first step was meeting with attorney Jennifer Walsh, whose downtown Phoenix office occupied the 15th floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the city. Walsh was younger than Georgina had expected, probably early 40s, with short auburn hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Detective Morrison filled me in on the basic situation," Walsh said, as they settled into her conference room. "But I need to hear your side of the story before we develop our strategy." As Georgina recounted the events of the past 48 hours, Walsh took detailed notes and occasionally asked pointed questions about timing, documentation, and Patricia's specific claims. Her approach was methodical and reassuring. This wasn't her first experience with adoption fraud cases. "The good news is that Patricia made several critical legal errors," Walsh explained after reviewing Morrison's evidence files. "First, she filed fraudulent documents with the court, which is a felony. Second, she attempted to interfere with a legitimate legal proceeding through deceptive means. And third, she's trying to claim authority over assets that don't belong to her." But Walsh also warned that shutting down Patricia's scheme wouldn't be as simple as exposing her lies. The criminal network had learned to exploit gaps in the legal system, using procedural delays and bureaucratic confusion to maintain their cons for weeks or even months. "They're counting on the fact that most people don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively," Walsh said. "They create enough legal chaos that their victims often agree to settlements just to make the problems go away." The strategy Walsh proposed was aggressive and multi-pronged. They would file complaints with the State Bar Association, request expedited forensic analysis of Patricia's documents, and coordinate with the FBI to ensure the criminal charges moved forward quickly. Most importantly, they would push for an emergency hearing to get the adoption proceedings back on track. "But I need you to understand something," Walsh said, her expression becoming more serious. "Once we start this fight, Patricia and her associates are going to escalate their tactics. They may try to intimidate you, spread false information about your family, or create new legal complications. Are you prepared for that?" Georgina thought about the years she'd spent navigating the foster care system, the resilience she'd developed through constant upheaval and uncertainty. "I've been dealing with people trying to control my life since I was a kid. At least this time I know who the enemy is." The next few days became a whirlwind of legal preparation and evidence gathering. Walsh had connected Georgina with a forensic document analyst named Sarah Kim, whose expertise in detecting fraudulent paperwork had made her a sought-after expert witness in white-collar crime cases. Dr. Kim's analysis of Patricia's documents was damning and thorough. Under microscopic examination, the hospital records showed clear signs of digital manipulation, with timestamps that had been altered and signatures that had been copied from other documents.
The bank records were even more obviously fake, with formatting inconsistencies that suggested they'd been created using basic desktop publishing software rather than actual banking systems. Whoever created these documents has some skill with graphic design software, Dr. Kim explained, as she showed Georgina the evidence under high-powered magnification. But they don't understand the security features that legitimate institutions build into their official paperwork. These forgeries would fool a casual observer, but they can't withstand professional scrutiny. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison's investigation had uncovered more details about Patricia's criminal network. The black sedan that had been photographed at the courthouse was registered to a shell company in Nevada that existed only on paper. The Vincent Torres who'd met with Patricia had been using false identity. His real name was Vincent Maddox, and he had prior convictions for identity theft in California and Texas. But it was Tyler's involvement that provided the most insights into how the scheme operated. Morrison had obtained phone records showing that Tyler had been in contact with other young people across the Southwest, all of whom had been targeted during family transitions or inheritance procedures. He's essentially a professional fake sibling, Morrison explained, during one of their strategy meetings. His job is to create emotional connections that make the victims more susceptible to the family's financial demands. In your case, he was supposed to build a relationship with you and then pressure you to help the family with various expenses. The sophistication of the operation was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Patricia's network had developed detailed profiles of their targets, identifying specific vulnerabilities and crafting personalized approaches for each victim. They researched family histories, financial situations, and emotional needs with the thoroughness of professional investigators.
Georgina's case had been particularly attractive to them because of her background in the foster system. They'd correctly identified that someone who'd grown up without stable family connections would be especially vulnerable to claims of biological kinship and offers of belonging. They prey on people's fundamental need for family and connection, Walsh observed. It's one of the most emotionally manipulative forms of fraud I've ever encountered. But as they built their case against Patricia, Georgina also began to uncover positive discoveries about her actual family history. The life insurance policy that her mother had maintained turned out to be just one of several financial resources that Rebecca had quietly established before her death. Working with a probate attorney recommended by Walsh, Georgina learned that her mother had also opened a small education savings account and had been making regular contributions to it, even during her struggles with addiction. The account had grown to nearly $15,000 over the years, money that could help cover the remaining costs of Georgina's college education. Your mother was trying to take care of your future, even when she couldn't take care of herself, the probate attorney explained. She may have made mistakes, but she never stopped thinking about your well-being. The discovery provided a new perspective on Rebecca's troubled life and tragic death. Rather than the neglectful parent that Georgina had sometimes imagined, she began to see a woman who'd been fighting her own demons while still trying to provide for her daughter's future. These revelations came at a crucial time because Patricia's network was indeed escalating their tactics as Walsh had predicted. Anonymous phone calls to the Johnson house claimed to have additional information about Georgina's real family. Fake social media profiles began posting misleading information about the adoption proceedings, trying to create public pressure for Georgina to accept her biological heritage. Most disturbingly, Tyler began showing up at places where Georgina regularly spent time. The coffee shop near the university campus where she worked part-time, the grocery store where Susan was employed, even the gym where she maintained her membership. He never approached her directly, but his presence was clearly intended to create anxiety and pressure. It's psychological warfare, Morrison explained. They want you to feel like you can't escape from their influence, that agreeing to their demands is easier than continuing to fight. But the tactics that were meant to intimidate Georgina actually had the opposite effect. Seeing the lengths to which Patricia's network would go to manipulate her only strengthened her resolve to expose their fraud and protect other potential victims.
Working with Morrison and Walsh, Georgina began documenting every attempted contact, every suspicious phone call, and every piece of misinformation that Patricia's associates spread. They were building not just a defense against the immediate threat, but a comprehensive case that could shut down the entire criminal operation. The process was emotionally exhausting, but it was also empowering in ways Georgina hadn't expected. For most of her life, she'd been acted upon by adults with authority and power, social workers who moved her between homes, judges who made decisions about her custody, administrators who controlled her access to resources. Now, for the first time, she was fighting back against people who saw her as easy prey. She was taking control of her own narrative and refusing to let criminals profit from her vulnerabilities. The first steps forward in her battle against Patricia's scheme were also first steps toward a new understanding of her own strength and agency. She was no longer the scared foster kid who'd learned to accept whatever adults decided was best for her. She was becoming someone who fought for her own truth.
Just as Georgina began to feel confident about their legal strategy, Patricia's criminal network revealed the true depth of their sophistication and ruthlessness. What had started as document fraud escalated into something far more dangerous when they realized their original plan was failing. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning when Jennifer Walsh called with urgent news. "Georgina, we have a serious problem. Patricia filed an emergency motion claiming that you and the Johnsons have been hiding assets that legally belong to the Daniels Family Trust. She's requesting an immediate freeze on all your financial accounts pending a full audit." The implications hit Georgina like a sledgehammer. A financial freeze would prevent her from paying tuition, covering living expenses, or even accessing the money she'd earned from her part-time campus job. Worse, it would put the Johnson family's finances under legal scrutiny at a time when Robert was already struggling with reduced work hours due to a shoulder injury. "How can she do that without any proof?" Georgina asked, her voice rising with panic. "She's presenting what appears to be a sworn affidavit from Marcus Daniels himself, claiming that he established a trust fund for your benefit years ago and that your adoptive family has been illegally accessing those funds," Walsh explained grimly. The document looks more sophisticated than her previous forgeries. Someone with serious resources has joined their operation. The fake affidavit was a masterpiece of criminal deception. Unlike Patricia's earlier crude forgeries, this document had been crafted by professionals who understood legal terminology and formatting requirements. It included fabricated trust documentation, fake bank statements, and even counterfeit notarization that would fool anyone except an expert examiner. But the most devastating aspect of the new scheme was its targeting of the Johnson family's reputation. The affidavit claimed that Robert and Susan had knowingly concealed the existence of trust funds while collecting state payments for Georgina's foster care, essentially accusing them of defrauding the government for years. "This is character assassination," Susan said, her voice shaking as she read the legal documents. "They're trying to destroy our family's reputation to force us to give up fighting them." The timing of the attack was calculated for maximum impact. Robert was scheduled for shoulder surgery the following week, which would keep him out of work for at least a month. Susan's hours at the grocery store had already been cut due to store restructuring. The family could not afford a prolonged legal battle, especially with their financial accounts frozen pending investigation. Patricia's network had clearly researched the Johnson family's financial situation and identified their pressure points with surgical precision. They were betting that the family would agree to some kind of settlement rather than risk financial ruin fighting obviously false charges. Detective Morrison arrived at the Johnson house that evening with more disturbing news. Her contacts in law enforcement had discovered that Patricia's operation was larger and more connected than they had initially realized. The Vincent Maddox, who'd been photographed meeting with Patricia, was actually a mid-level player in a multi-state criminal enterprise that specialized in legal fraud schemes. "We're not just dealing with a small-time con artist anymore,"
Morrison explained. Patricia's bosses have decided that your case is worth significant investment because of the precedent it could set. If they can successfully manipulate adoption proceedings using fraudulent trust claims, they can replicate the scheme across the country. The criminal network had brought in what law enforcement called a cleanup crew, specialists in document forgery, legal intimidation, and reputation destruction who were deployed when their standard tactics failed. These professionals had access to sophisticated equipment and connections within various bureaucratic systems that allowed them to create convincing false documentation.
Even more troubling, Morrison's investigation had uncovered evidence that the network had corrupted at least one court clerk in the Maricopa County system. Someone with access to official filing systems had been providing Patricia's associates with detailed information about pending cases and helping them navigate legal procedures with unusual efficiency. They know exactly which judges to target, which clerks to bribe, and which legal loopholes to exploit, Morrison said. This isn't amateur hour anymore. The escalation put enormous strain on Georgina's relationship with the Johnsons. Despite their reassurances that they would fight the accusations, she could see the worry lines deepening around Susan's eyes and the way Robert winced every time he moved his injured shoulder. The family that had provided her with stability and unconditional love was being torn apart because criminals saw her as a profitable target. "Maybe I should just give them what they want," Georgina said one evening as she watched Susan struggling with the family's bills at the kitchen table. "Maybe I should agree to some kind of settlement so this nightmare ends." "Absolutely not," Robert said firmly, despite the pain medication making his words slightly slurred. "These people are criminals, Georgina. If we give in to them now, they'll just target someone else's family next." But the pressure was becoming unbearable. Anonymous phone calls to the Johnson house escalated from simple intimidation to detailed threats about what would happen if they continued fighting. Someone vandalized Susan's car in the grocery store parking lot, spray painting "liar" across the driver's side door. Tyler began appearing at Georgina's workplace more frequently, sometimes sitting in the coffee shop for hours while staring at her with undisguised hostility. The harassment campaign was designed to isolate Georgina from her support system and make her feel that cooperation was her only option. Patricia's network had studied psychological manipulation techniques and understood exactly how to exploit the guilt and protective instincts that foster children often develop toward their caregivers. The crisis reached its peak when Jennifer Walsh called with devastating news. The sophisticated forgeries had temporarily convinced a different judge to grant Patricia's request for a preliminary asset freeze. All of the Johnson family's bank accounts, along with Georgina's student financial aid, had been locked, pending a full investigation that could take months to complete. "This is exactly what they wanted," Walsh explained during an emergency meeting at her office. "They've created enough legal chaos that fighting them becomes financially impossible for most families. They're counting on you running out of resources before the truth comes to light." But the asset freeze had an unexpected consequence that Patricia's network hadn't anticipated. News of the fraudulent legal actions spread through the foster care community in Phoenix, reaching other families who had been targeted by similar schemes. Walsh's office began receiving calls from attorneys representing families across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico who had been victimized by variations of the same con. Detective Morrison realized they were looking at the tip of a much larger iceberg. Patricia's network had been operating for years, targeting vulnerable families during transitions and using sophisticated legal manipulation to extract settlements or gain access to assets. The total financial damage across all their victims likely exceeded several $1,000,000. "Your case has become the focal point for a major federal investigation," Morrison explained. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit wants to use your situation to take down the entire network, but that means the criminals are going to throw everything they have at stopping you." The stakes had escalated far beyond Georgina's individual adoption case. She had become the key witness in a federal investigation that could shut down a criminal enterprise and protect hundreds of other potential victims. But fighting that battle meant risking everything she cared about: the Johnson family's financial security, her own education and future plans, and possibly even their physical safety. Standing in the Johnson kitchen late that night, looking at the stack of legal documents and bills that covered the table, Georgina felt the full weight of the impossible choice Patricia's network had forced upon her. She could surrender to their demands and save her family from further harm, or she could continue fighting and risk losing everything that mattered to her.
The scared foster child who had learned to avoid confrontation was being asked to become the point person in a battle against sophisticated criminals who had vast resources and few moral constraints. The major challenge that would define the rest of her life was no longer just about proving her right to choose her own family. It was about whether she had the courage to stand up to people who destroyed lives for profit.
The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when Georgina returned home from her campus job to find Susan sitting at the kitchen table, crying over a pile of medical bills. Robert's shoulder surgery had been postponed indefinitely because their insurance company had flagged their account due to the ongoing legal investigation. Without access to their frozen assets, the family couldn't afford the surgery's deductible, leaving Robert in constant pain and unable to work. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Susan whispered when she saw Georgina in the doorway. "I tried to hold it together, but I just don't know how we're going to manage. The mortgage payment is due next week, and I can't even access our checking account to buy groceries." Georgina felt something break inside her chest. The woman who had given her unconditional love for 7 years was suffering because criminals had targeted her. The man who had taught her to drive and cheered at her graduation was in physical agony because their family's finances had been weaponized against them. That night, alone in her childhood bedroom, Georgina stared at the ceiling and confronted the brutal reality of her situation. Every choice she made seemed to lead to more pain for the people she loved. Fighting Patricia's network was destroying the Johnson family financially and emotionally. But surrendering to the criminals would validate their tactics and enable them to destroy other families in the future. The weight of that responsibility felt crushing. At 23, she was being asked to sacrifice her family's well-being for the sake of strangers she would never meet. The foster care system had taught her to prioritize her own survival and the safety of the few people who truly cared about her. The idea of risking everything for abstract principles of justice felt impossibly naive. Her phone buzzed with another text from Tyler. "This doesn't have to be so hard. My mom just wants to talk. We could work something out that helps everyone." For the first time since the courthouse confrontation, Georgina seriously considered responding. Maybe there was a middle ground that would end the harassment without completely surrendering to the criminals' demands. Maybe she could negotiate some kind of settlement that would free the Johnson family's assets while still exposing Patricia's fraud. But as she typed and deleted potential responses, another message arrived from an unknown number. "Stop fighting us, or your foster family will face consequences beyond financial problems." The threat was clear and terrifying. Patricia's network wasn't just attacking their money anymore. They were threatening physical harm to the people Georgina loved most. The escalation from fraud to intimidation to outright menace had reached a point where continuing the fight felt like endangering innocent lives. Detective Morrison arrived the next morning with more devastating news. The corrupt court clerk who had been helping Patricia's network had leaked information about the federal investigation to the criminals. They now knew exactly which evidence law enforcement had gathered and which aspects of their operation were most vulnerable to prosecution. "They're 3 steps ahead of us," Morrison admitted, her usually confident demeanor cracking. "Every move we make, they seem to anticipate. They've got sources inside the system that we haven't identified yet." The leaked information had allowed Patricia's associates to destroy key evidence and relocate their operations before law enforcement could act. Vincent Maddox had disappeared entirely, presumably fleeing to a jurisdiction where extradition would be difficult. Several other members of the network had suddenly taken extended trips out of the country. "Without the physical evidence and key witnesses, the federal case is falling apart," Morrison explained. "They might be able to prosecute Patricia on the original forgery charges, but the larger criminal enterprise is going to escape justice." Jennifer Walsh delivered the final crushing blow during a conference call that afternoon. The judge who had granted the asset freeze was refusing to reverse his decision until the investigation was complete, despite the mounting evidence that Patricia's documentation was fraudulent. The legal system's bureaucratic pace was working in favor of the criminals who had designed their scheme to exploit exactly these kinds of procedural delays. "I have to be honest with you," Walsh said, her voice heavy with defeat. "We're looking at months, possibly years, before this gets resolved through normal legal channels. And that's assuming the federal case doesn't collapse entirely, which is looking increasingly likely."
The prospect of years of frozen assets, continued harassment, and legal uncertainty was more than the Johnson family could bear. Robert's medical condition was deteriorating without treatment. Susan had been forced to take a leave of absence from work due to the stress-related health problems she was experiencing. The modest savings they had worked decades to accumulate were locked away by court order while criminals with fake documents controlled their lives. That evening, Georgina made a decision that felt like abandoning everything she believed about right and wrong. She called the number Tyler had been texting from and agreed to meet with Patricia for negotiations. The meeting was set for a neutral location, a family restaurant in downtown Tempe where Patricia presumably felt safe from surveillance. Georgina arrived early and sat in a corner booth, her hands shaking as she waited for the woman who had turned her life into a nightmare. Patricia entered the restaurant looking triumphant, accompanied by a well-dressed man who was presumably another member of her legal team. She had the satisfied expression of someone who had won a difficult game through superior strategy and resources. "I'm glad you decided to be reasonable," Patricia said as she slid into the booth across from Georgina. "This has been much more complicated than it needed to be." The casual cruelty of the statement, the implication that Georgina's suffering was simply the result of her own stubbornness, sparked a flash of anger that cut through her despair. But she forced herself to remain calm, remembering that her goal was to negotiate an end to the harassment, not to satisfy her desire for justice. "What do you want?" Georgina asked. Patricia smiled and opened a folder containing legal documents. "It's quite simple. You sign these papers acknowledging that Marcus Daniels is your biological father and that you're waiving any claim to the assets your mother left behind. In exchange, we'll have the court orders lifted and your family's accounts unfrozen within 48 hours. The documents were more sophisticated than Georgina had expected, clearly drafted by attorneys who understood how to create legally binding agreements. By signing, she wouldn't just be giving up her mother's life insurance money, she would be validating the entire fraud and potentially making herself complicit in Patricia's crimes. "And if I don't sign?" Patricia's expression hardened. "Then this drags on indefinitely. Your foster family's finances remain frozen. The investigation continues with all its associated costs and complications, and other pressures escalate as my associates become more impatient with the situation." The threat was delivered with the calm professionalism of a businesswoman discussing quarterly projections. To Patricia, destroying families was simply a job that required efficient completion. Georgina stared at the papers, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Every signature line represented another betrayal of her own principles, of Detective Morrison's investigation, of the future victims who would suffer if Patricia's network continued operating. But refusing to sign meant watching the Johnson family suffer indefinitely while criminals with unlimited resources and corrupt connections maintained their advantage through sheer persistence and brutality. Sitting in that restaurant booth, with Patricia's cold eyes watching every expression and the legal documents spread across the table like an instrument of surrender, Georgina felt more alone and powerless than she had since her darkest days in the foster system. The scared child who had learned to accept whatever adults decided was best for her was being asked to make a choice that would define not just her own future, but the futures of everyone she loved. In her darkest moment, with the pen in her hand and Patricia's satisfied smile growing wider, Georgina realized that this was exactly where the criminals had wanted her from the beginning, isolated, desperate, and convinced that surrender was her only option.
As Georgina sat in that restaurant booth, with the pen hovering over Patricia's fraudulent documents, something unexpected happened. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maya Chin, her college roommate, who had no idea about the legal nightmare consuming Georgina's life. The message was simple. "Saw your mom at graduation last year crying happy tears. Some families are chosen, not born. Hope your adoption went amazing." The message was like a lightning bolt of clarity, cutting through the fog of desperation and manipulation. Maya had unconsciously used the word mom to describe Susan Johnson, not foster mom or adoptive mom, just mom.
To the outside world, to people who knew them as a family, the Johnsons weren't Georgina's legal guardians or temporary caretakers. They were simply her parents. Patricia noticed Georgina's hesitation and leaned forward with predatory urgency. The longer you wait, the more expensive this becomes for everyone involved. Sign the papers, and this nightmare ends today. But instead of signing, Georgina slowly put the pen down and looked directly into Patricia's eyes. No. The single word hung in the air like a declaration of war. Patricia's confident expression flickered with surprise and annoyance. I don't think you understand the consequences of refusing our generous offer, Patricia said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. Your foster family situation can become much worse than frozen bank accounts. And I don't think you understand who you're dealing with, Georgina replied, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. I've survived the foster care system, which means I've dealt with bullies, liars, and manipulators my entire life. You're just better dressed than most of them. Something had crystallized in that moment of refusal. Years of being moved between homes, of having her life controlled by adults with hidden agendas, of learning to read people's true intentions beneath their surface promises. All of that experience had been preparing her for exactly this confrontation. Patricia's mask of professional civility finally slipped completely. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into, little girl. We have resources you can't imagine and connections that reach into the Maricopa County court system. I know, Georgina interrupted. You've been bribing clerks and manipulating procedures. But here's what you don't know. Detective Morrison has been recording this entire conversation. It was a bluff, but Patricia's immediate panic told Georgina that her instincts were correct. The criminal network's confidence was built on secrecy and the assumption that their victims were too isolated and overwhelmed to fight back strategically. Patricia started to stand, but Georgina continued talking, her voice growing stronger with each word. Most importantly, you made one crucial mistake. You assumed I was just another scared foster kid who would do anything to avoid conflict, but I'm not that person anymore. I'm someone who chose her family, and I'll fight for them no matter what threats you make. Standing up from the booth, Georgina felt a transformation taking place that went beyond the immediate confrontation. She was shedding the last vestiges of the powerless child who had learned to accept whatever adults decided was best for her. In its place was emerging a young woman who understood her own worth and refused to let criminals profit from her vulnerabilities.
You can keep your forged documents and your fake family connections, Georgina said as she prepared to leave. I already know who my real family is, and they're worth fighting for. Walking out of that restaurant felt like walking out of her entire past as a victim. But the real breakthrough came when she returned home to find Detective Morrison, Jennifer Walsh, and several FBI agents waiting in the Johnson living room with news that would change everything. The breakthrough we needed came from an unexpected source, Morrison explained with barely contained excitement. Remember that corrupt court clerk we couldn't identify? He got nervous about the federal investigation and decided to cooperate with law enforcement in exchange for immunity. The clerk's cooperation had provided investigators with a complete roadmap of Patricia's criminal network. More importantly, he had secretly recorded conversations with Vincent Maddox that detailed the entire adoption disruption scheme, including their plans to expand the operation nationally. We've been making arrests all afternoon, one of the FBI agents reported. Patricia, Vincent, and 6 other associates are in custody. We've also recovered over $2 million in assets stolen from families across 4 states. But the most satisfying news was yet to come. The real Marcus Daniels had been contacted in Spain and was cooperating fully with the investigation. Not only did he confirm that he had never been married to Patricia and had no children named Georgina, but his actual wife, Jennifer, was pursuing her own legal action against the criminals for identity theft and defamation. The asset freeze on your family's accounts was lifted an hour ago, Walsh announced with a smile. All charges against the Johnson family have been dropped, and the state is expediting your adoption proceedings as compensation for the harassment you've endured. The legal victory was complete, but the personal transformation was even more significant.
Over the following weeks, as the criminal network was prosecuted and dismantled, Georgina discovered reserves of strength and confidence she hadn't known she possessed. Her background in journalism made her an effective spokesperson for legislative changes to protect vulnerable families during legal transitions. 3 months later, Georgina Roberts officially became Georgina Johnson in a courthouse ceremony that was everything the original adoption should have been. Judge Hendricks presided with obvious satisfaction, noting that the case had led to important reforms in document verification procedures. Family isn't just about legal papers or biological connections, the judge said during the ceremony. It's about love, commitment, and the choice to stand by each other through the most difficult challenges. This family has proven that their bonds are stronger than any criminal scheme. Roberts' shoulder surgery had been successful, and he returned to work with a newfound appreciation for the family he'd helped protect. Susan had resumed her grocery store job, but was also volunteering with foster care organizations to help other families navigate the legal system. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in Georgina herself. The young woman who had once defined herself primarily through her foster care background and academic achievements now understood that her identity was much more complex and powerful than she had ever imagined. Standing in the courthouse that day, holding her official adoption certificate, Georgina realized that Patricia's criminal scheme had inadvertently given her something valuable. By forcing her to fight for her chosen family, the experience had taught her that belonging wasn't something that could be granted or taken away by external authorities. It was something she had the power to claim and defend herself. 6 months later, Georgina graduated magna cum laude with her journalism degree and accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that investigates financial crimes targeting vulnerable populations. Her first major investigation focused on adoption fraud schemes operating across the southwestern United States. The scared foster child who had learned to avoid confrontation had become someone who sought out injustice and fought to protect others from the kind of exploitation she had survived. The transformation was complete not because she had defeated her enemies, but because she had discovered who she really was when everything she valued was at stake. On quiet evenings at the Johnson house, when Susan was reading in her favorite chair and Robert was watching baseball on television, Georgina would sometimes reflect on how dramatically her life had changed. The family she had always belonged to was now legally recognized, but more importantly, she had learned that some bonds are strong enough to survive any test. The criminals who had tried to destroy her family for profit had instead taught her the most valuable lesson of her life: that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to fight for what matters most, regardless of the cost. Patricia Vance was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. She never did meet the real Marcus Daniels, who testified via video link from Span that he had never heard of her before her arrest. Tyler was sentenced to 5 years in juvenile detention and court-ordered therapy. In a letter he wrote to Georgina as part of his rehabilitation program, he apologized for his role in the scheme and thanked her for refusing to give up the fight that ultimately led to his rescue from his mother's criminal influence. The $50,000 life insurance policy that had started the entire nightmare was finally released to Georgina, along with the education savings account her mother had maintained. She used the money to establish a scholarship fund for foster children pursuing higher education, ensuring that her mother's final gift would help other young people build better futures. And on the first anniversary of her official adoption, Georgina Johnson, daughter, graduate, journalist, and survivor, looked forward to a future she had earned the right to choose for herself.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.